Put your hands where I can see them. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound on the Riverwalk that afternoon, louder than the water, louder than the gasps rippling through the small crowd that had gathered on the brick paths. 12-year-old Emma Carter, a black seventh grader with a library book still tucked in her backpack, stood frozen beside her turquoise bicycle, wrists locked behind her back, helmet still strapped under her chin. 10 minutes earlier, she had been pedaling home from the library with the wind in her face. Now she was being treated like a criminal in broad daylight, and she hadn't even been asked her name. It started with a woman in pressed linen and gold bracelets stepping directly into Emma's path. "That's my niece's bike," Linda Harper said, loud enough for 3 passing families to turn their heads. "I'd recognize that scratch on the frame anywhere." Emma's hands tightened on the handlebars. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "Ma'am, can you tell me what your niece's bike looks like?" Linda didn't answer the question. She pulled out her phone instead, dialing 911 with the theatrical urgency of someone performing outrage for an audience. Within minutes, a patrol car rolled up, lights flashing against the water. Officer Daniel Brooks approached with the easy confidence of a man who had already decided how this would end. He asked Emma's name a formality, nothing more. When she answered, calm but trembling, he barely looked at her. He looked at Linda, at her certainty, at the scratch on the frame that could have come from 100 ordinary afternoons. "Ma'am, step back," Brooks said to Emma, not to Linda. "We're going to sort this out the easy way." The crowd along the path had grown. Phones came up before hands went down. Nobody stepped forward. A man in running shoes slowed his pace, watched, and kept walking. A mother pulled her own daughter a little closer, murmuring something Emma couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear enough. "Stay away from this." Emma didn't cry. She didn't run. She stood very still, the way her father had taught her, though her fingers dug into the strap of her backpack until her knuckles paled. Inside that backpack was a receipt she didn't yet know would matter, a library card, and a half-eaten granola bar from lunch. Nothing that looked like evidence of anything except a normal Saturday, cut in half by a stranger's certainty. "This isn't fair," Emma whispered, more to herself than to anyone listening. Brooks wasn't listening. He turned her gently but firmly by the shoulder, and the cuffs closed around wrists that, 3 hours earlier, had been turning the pages of a library book about the solar system. "Then I call my dad?" Emma asked, her voice cracking on the last word. "Your dad can explain everything later," Brooks said, already walking her toward the patrol car. What Officer Brooks didn't know, what nobody standing on that sunlit path knew, was that Emma's father was less than 400 yards away, walking briskly toward the Riverwalk with a coffee in one hand and no idea that his daughter was, at this exact moment, being placed in the back of a police car for the crime of owning her own bicycle. I was about to become the last person in Naperville that Officer Daniel Brooks and Linda Harper ever wanted to meet. If watching a child get handcuffed over an accusation, nobody bothered to check, made your stomach turn a little. Stay with this one, because what Michael Carter does over the next 20 minutes is exactly why stories like this are worth sticking around for. Hit subscribe now, so you don't miss how this ends. Status doesn't tell you who a person really is. It only tells you how the world has decided to treat them until the moment it's forced to look closer. To understand what was about to happen on that sunlit path, you have to go back further than that. Saturday afternoon, back through the quiet years that shaped the man now walking toward it. Michael Carter tucked his daughter into bed nearly every night of her life, and told her some version of the same thing. Calm is not the absence of fear. Calm is still being able to think while you're afraid. He had learned that lesson the hard way, not in a boardroom, not in a classroom, but on the worst nights of other people's lives. Michael Carter, 40, was the fire chief of a district just outside Chicago, a position he had spent 20 years earning one shift, one commendation, 1 call at a time. He had walked into burning apartment buildings when the smoke was thick enough to swallow flashlight beams. He had knelt beside strangers in the last minutes of car accidents and kept his voice level enough that they believed, for just a little longer, that everything was going to be fine. He had trained hundreds of firefighters, paramedics, and more than a few times police officers in the discipline that mattered most in a crisis. Assess before you act. None of his neighbors on Bellwood Court knew any of this. To them, Michael Carter was simply Emma's dad, the quiet man who wore a navy polo and khakis on weekends, who showed up to school pickup on time, who spent his Saturdays at the library with his daughter instead of golfing or grilling with the other fathers on the block. He rarely mentioned his job. When neighbors asked, he'd say only, "I work in emergency services," and let the conversation move on. It wasn't secrecy. It was simply that Michael had learned long ago that a title changes how people treat you, and he had never wanted to be treated any differently than the man next door. The same man who mowed his own lawn on Sundays and forgot, more often than not, to take his gear bag out of the trunk before pulling into the driveway. There was a reason for that gap between his two worlds. To a quieter, harder reason. 6 years earlier, Michael had been offered a promotion to regional director, a desk job with triple the salary and none of the sirens. He had turned it down. His wife had been diagnosed with early-onset multiple sclerosis that same year, and somewhere between hospital visits and Emma's second-grade recitals, Michael had made a decision that no one at headquarters fully understood. He would rather be a chief who still answered calls himself, who was home for dinner 3 nights a week, who could leave a shift and be at his daughter's side within the hour, than a name on a door in a downtown office tower. His wife passed 2 years later. Emma was 8. Michael never once explained, to a single person on Bellwood Court, why he'd chosen the life he had. He simply lived it, quietly, one ordinary day at a time. He raised Emma the way he ran a fire scene, with structure, with calm, with the belief that panic was a luxury nobody in a crisis could afford. "Keep your receipts," he told her, the way other fathers might tell their kids to look both ways before crossing the street. "Take pictures of things that matter to you. Remember serial numbers. And if someone in a uniform ever asks you something, you answer honestly, but you always have the right to ask them to verify what they're accusing you of." Emma had absorbed all of it, quietly, the way children absorb the things that matter most. She didn't fully understand, at 7 or 8 or 10, why her father was so insistent on these small rituals of documentation and composure. She understood it now, standing on the Riverwalk with her wrists cuffed behind her back, a version of calm cracking open inside her that she had never had to test before. Now step back further, not to Michael, but to the woman who had set this entire afternoon in motion. Linda Harper, sat on the board of the Bellwood Court Homeowners Association, a position she treated less like a volunteer duty and more like a personal mandate. She had lived in the neighborhood for 18 years, longer than almost anyone else on the board, and she had convinced herself, slowly and thoroughly, that the neighborhood's safety rested on her vigilance alone. 3 months before that Saturday, Linda had proposed a new HOA policy. Children under 16 would not be permitted to play or ride bicycles on neighborhood streets after 6 p.m. She had stood before the board with printed statistics about declining suburban safety and a tone that suggested the matter was already settled. Michael Carter had been the one to stand up and say it wasn't. "With respect," he'd said, in the same even, unhurried voice he used on emergency calls. "A curfew like this doesn't make anyone safer. It just tells certain families their kids don't belong outside as much as everyone else's kids do." He hadn't raised his voice. I hadn't needed to. The board voted the proposal down, 6-2, and Linda Harper had sat through the rest of the meeting with her jaw set, humiliated in front of people whose opinion of her mattered a great deal. She never forgot it. And in the months that followed, without ever consciously deciding to, Linda began watching the Carter house a little more closely than she watched anyone else's, not out of malice. Exactly. But out of the particular. self-righteous grievance of someone who believes they were wronged and is waiting, quietly, for the world to prove them right. So when she saw an unfamiliar bicycle turquoise, brand new, gleaming, ridden by a girl she barely recognized despite having lived 4 houses down from her for 6 years, something in Linda seized on it immediately. Not curiosity. Certainty. This was the proof she'd been waiting for. This was the neighborhood slipping the way she'd warned them it would. She had not seen her own niece's bicycle in over a year. She could not, if pressed, have described its scratches with any real accuracy. But conviction, for Linda Harper, had never required evidence. It only required a feeling strong enough to act on, and a girl who looked, to her, like she didn't belong on that path. If you're wondering whether Linda ever second-guessed herself in that moment before she dialed 911, she didn't. And that single missing second of doubt was about to cost her far more than she could have imagined. Back on the Riverwalk, Michael Carter was 3 minutes from a scene that would upend every assumption anyone standing there had made about him. He walked briskly, coffee in hand, mind still half on a budget meeting from that morning until he saw the flashing lights ahead, the small crowd gathered along the paths, and a familiar turquoise bicycle lying on its side near a patrol car. Something in his chest went cold and, at the same time, perfectly, professionally still. It was the same feeling he got walking into a building he hadn't yet assessed. Don't run. Don't yell. Look first. I didn't know yet that the officer standing over his daughter had once sat, 18 months earlier, in the 3rd row of a joint interagency training session, a session on de-escalation and evidence-based decision-making, taught by a fire chief whose name he'd since forgotten. I didn't know that the woman filming the whole scene on her phone had a printed HOA meeting agenda from 3 months ago still sitting, unread again, in a drawer in her kitchen, the one where his objection to her curfew proposal was recorded. Word for word. In the minutes. All Michael Carter knew, walking toward the flashing lights, was that his daughter was standing with her hands cuffed behind her back, and that whoever had done this to her was about to learn, in the next 10 minutes, exactly how far his calm could carry him, and how badly they had misjudged the man in the navy polo shirt. Michael Carter did not run toward the patrol car. I walked fast, but measured, the way he had trained 100 rookies to move through a scene where panic would only make things worse. "Officer," he said, stopping a careful distance away, hands visible, voice level. "I'm her father. Please tell me what's happening. And please don't let anyone add anything else to this situation until we're sure of the facts." Officer Brooks glanced at him, then back at Emma, then at Linda Harper, who was already recounting her version of events to a second bystander with the flourish of someone enjoying an audience. Brooks did not answer Michael directly. Instead, he gestured toward a bench near a trash can at the edge of the path, a few feet from the water, in the shade of nobody's tree. "Sir, I need you to wait over there while we sort this out." It was such a small thing, a bench by a trash can, but it did exactly what it was meant to do. It put Michael on the outside of his own daughter's ordeal, a spectator to whatever the officer decided to do next, while Linda Harper stood close enough to Brooks to keep murmuring in his ear. She wasn't asked to step aside. She wasn't asked to wait. She was treated, from the first minute, as the reasonable party in the conversation, and Michael as an interruption to it. I sat, not because he accepted it, but because he understood something Brooks didn't yet. Patience, applied correctly, was not weakness. It was the only tool that would actually work here. Is patience wisdom, or is it a mistake? Michael was about to find out which one it would be, in real time, in front of a growing crowd of strangers with their phones already raised. "Ma'am," Brooks said to Linda, his tone almost gentle, "can you describe the bike in more detail? Anything specific?" "The scratch," Linda said instantly. "Right there on the frame. Near the pedal. I'd know it anywhere." Brooks crouched, examined the scratch, a shallow, ordinary mark that could have come from 100 sources, and nodded slowly. The nod of a man already halfway convinced. He straightened up and turned toward Emma, who was still standing with her hands cuffed behind her back. 12 years old, in a helmet and khaki shorts, looking very small against the width of the paths. "Do you have any proof this bike is yours?" he asked her. It was the question that should have been asked first, hours before the handcuffs. But Emma answered it anyway, her voice thin but steady. "My dad has the receipt on his phone, and there's a serial number it's registered." Brooks looked past her, toward Michael on the bench. "Sir, can you come show me that?" Michael stood immediately. Phone already in hand, he'd pulled it out the second he sat down, anticipating exactly this moment. He crossed the distance in 4 steps and held the screen out. An order confirmation email from a bike shop in Naperville, dated 2 months earlier, with Emma's name on it. Below it, a warranty registration with a serial number. Below that, a photo Emma on her birthday, grinning beside the same turquoise bike, a paper bow still stuck crookedly to the handlebars. "The serial numbers stamped under the bottom bracket," Michael said. "Right here." He crouched, without asking permission, and gently turned the bike on its side so the number was visible. "You can call it in. Dispatch can confirm it in under 2 minutes. Brooks hesitated, the particular hesitation of a man who has already made up his mind and doesn't want to be told he was wrong before he's ready to admit it to himself. But with a dozen phones recording and a father standing calmly in front of him with documentation instead of outrage, he had no real choice. He radioed it in. 2 minutes and 11 seconds later, dispatch confirmed it. The bicycle belonged to Emma Carter. There was no report of a stolen bike anywhere in the district that week, let alone that afternoon. This should have been the end of it. An apology. The handcuffs off. A quiet, decent acknowledgement that a mistake had been made, and a girl who did nothing wrong had been treated like a criminal for several minutes on a public path. That is not what happened. I didn't know it yet. But Officer Brooks had just made the decision that would end up costing him far more than an apology ever would. "I still need to process this properly," Brooks said, not quite meeting Michael's eyes. "There's a procedure for these situations. I can't just release her because you showed me a phone." It was a strange thing to say, given that the phone had just been independently verified by his own dispatch. But admitting the stop had been wrong from the start was a harder thing for Brooks to do than simply stalling. So he stalled. He asked Michael for a second form of identification. He asked for the original paper receipt, which was at home, not on a phone. He kept Emma standing at the edge of the path for another 18 minutes, cuffs still on, while he filled out forms on a clipboard with visible reluctance, as if paperwork itself might somehow undo what everyone standing there had already watched happen. Linda Harper, for her part, did not apologize either. She stepped a few feet away, phone already open to the neighborhood Facebook group, and began typing. "Quick update for everyone at the Riverwalk today. There was a bike incident near the bridge. Police got involved. So glad we have people paying attention. Stay alert. Everyone." She hit post before Emma's handcuffs had even come off. Nothing in the message was, strictly speaking, a lie. And that was exactly what made it so effective. It told a story without ever having to be accountable for the story. It told a story where an unnamed girl on a stolen bike had been stopped, where the neighborhood had narrowly avoided some vague danger, where Linda herself was the hero of the afternoon, rather than the reason a child had spent nearly 20 humiliating minutes in handcuffs for nothing. By the time Brooks finally removed the cuffs, the post already had 14 comments. None of them mentioned Emma by name. All of them didn't need to. The small crowd along the path had mostly dispersed by then. Phones lowered. Show apparently over. A couple of people lingered near the benches, murmuring to each other in the particular tone people use when they've decided they already know what happened. Nobody came over to check on Emma. One woman, walking her dog, pulled the leash a little shorter as she passed, glancing at Emma the way you might glance at something you'd been warned about. Michael noticed all of it. He said nothing about it. Not yet. He simply knelt in front of his daughter, checked her wrists already showing the faint red imprint of the cuffs, and said, quietly, "You did everything right. Do you understand me?" "Everything." Emma nodded. But she didn't look at him. She was looking at the bike, lying on its side on the path, as if it belonged to someone else now. What happened over the following days was quieter than the scene on the Riverwalk. But in some ways it was worse, the kind of injustice that doesn't show up on video, because it happens in file cabinets and email chains where nobody is filming. Officer Brooks filed his incident report that evening. It made no mention of handcuffs being placed on a 12-year-old girl. It described the stop as a brief detainment pending verification of ownership. Language technically true and functionally dishonest. The kind of sentence written by someone who understands exactly how much a phrase can hide. 3 days later, when Michael formally requested the body cam footage through the department's public records process, he was told there had been a technical malfunction during a 20-minute window of that afternoon. A window that began, curiously, at almost the exact moment Michael had asked Brooks for his badge number. The footage before and after existed. The middle did not. Michael, who had spent 2 decades reviewing incident logs for a living, recognized the shape of that gap immediately. It wasn't proof of anything yet, but it was a thread, and he had learned a long time ago that threads like that were worth pulling. There was one more detail buried in the paperwork that Michael almost missed. Brooks's report had been co-signed by his supervising sergeant the same night, approved within the hour. No follow-up questions attached a level of speed. Michael recognized from his own department, where a sergeant signing off that fast on a report involving a minor usually meant one of 2 things. Either the report was airtight, or nobody had actually read it closely enough to notice it wasn't. Meanwhile, the Bellwood Court, Homeowners Association, sent a letter to the Carter household. Not an apology, but a notice reminding residents of community expectations around public conduct and safety awareness. A letter so carefully worded it never once acknowledged that the family receiving it was the one who had been wronged. Emma already knew, the way children always know more than adults think they do, that something about the last few days had shifted the way people on their street looked at her. A neighbor who used to wave from her porch every morning now found something urgent to do with her flower pots instead. A boy from Emma's grade, who lived 2 houses down and used to ride bikes with her most weekends, told her not unkindly, but not kindly, either, that his mom said he should hang out with other friends for a while. One neighbor, an older woman named Carol, who had known the Carters since they moved in, stopped Linda outside the mailboxes and asked, carefully, whether she was completely sure about what she'd posted online, whether she'd actually confirmed the bike belonged to her niece before calling the police. "I know what I saw," Linda said, already turning to check her own mailbox, ending the conversation before it could go any further. "Someone has to pay attention around here. That's all I'm doing." It wasn't an answer to the question Carol had actually asked. Carol noticed. She didn't push it, but she also didn't post anything supportive in the HOA group the way she once might have. And that small, quiet withdrawal of support was the first crack invisible to almost everyone, but real in the story Linda had built for herself. The hardest part wasn't the handcuffs. Michael would come to understand that later. The hardest part was what came after. Emma stopped riding her bike. It happened gradually, not a single refusal, but a slow retreat that Michael watched unfold in the garage every morning. The first few days, she simply took longer to get ready, finding reasons to delay. Then she stopped mentioning the library trips she used to ask for every Saturday. One evening, Michael found her standing in the doorway of the garage, just looking at the bike where it leaned against the wall, untouched, its tires slowly losing air. She reached out once, her fingers brushing the edge of the seat, and then pulled her hand back, quickly, as if the bicycle itself had done something to hurt her. Michael didn't say anything that night. I didn't tell her to get over it, or remind her that the bike was legally, indisputably hers. I understood, in a way that took him years of standing beside people on the worst days of their lives to learn. That logic doesn't undo fear. Only time, and patience, and small acts of steadiness can do that. So instead, every evening for the next 2 weeks, he went out to the garage alone. I didn't ask Emma to come. He simply worked tightening the brake cables, oiling the chain, pumping air back into the tires, cleaning the frame until the turquoise paint caught the light again, the way it had on the day she'd first ridden it. One evening, Emma appeared in the doorway while he was polishing the handlebars. She didn't say anything. She just watched. "The bike didn't hurt you," Michael said finally, not turning around. "The unfairness did. Those aren't the same thing, even though it might feel that way right now." Emma didn't answer, but she didn't leave the doorway either. And for Michael, in that moment, that was enough. A few days later, she came out to the garage on her own, without being asked, and sat on the concrete step while he worked. "Do you think Officer Brooks knows he was wrong?" she asked quietly. "I think he knows something went wrong," Michael said. "Whether he's willing to say it out loud, yet that's a different thing. Sometimes people need to see the whole picture laid out in front of them before they can admit what they already suspect." "Are you going to make him see it?" He finally turned to look at her. "I'm going to make sure the truth doesn't get to hide anymore. I intend to find out exactly what happened to you that afternoon. Every piece of it. And I intend to make sure it's written down somewhere. Nobody can quietly edit it away." Emma studied him for a moment, and something in her shoulders loosened, just slightly. For the first time in 2 weeks, I didn't know yet exactly how far the story of that Saturday afternoon would travel, or how many more layers of the incident he would end up peeling back. He only knew that somewhere in the department's records, in Linda Harper's phone, in a stretch of body cam footage that had conveniently gone dark for exactly 20 minutes, the truth was sitting untouched, waiting for someone patient enough and thorough enough to go find it. I intended to be exactly that person, and in less than 2 weeks, the same officer who had told a 12-year-old girl to wait by a trash can would be sitting in a hearing room across from Michael Carter, about to learn precisely who he had been talking down to that afternoon. The hearing room at Naperville City Hall was smaller than Michael had expected, a rectangle of fluorescent light, a long table for the Citizen Police Oversight Board, and 3 rows of folding chairs behind it, most of them empty except for a court reporter, a records clerk, and, near the back, Linda Harper, who had been asked to attend as a witness and had chosen a seat as close to the exit as courtesy allowed. Officer Brooks sat at a separate table with his union representative, a folder of paperwork squared neatly in front of him, the posture of a man who still believed, on some level, that this would resolve the way most things resolved for him, with an apology accepted, a note in a file. Returned to his usual rounds by the following week, Michael sat beside a manila folder of his own, thicker than Brooks's by a wide margin, and beside him sat Renata Okafor, a civil rights attorney he'd known for nearly a decade through interagency work. Not there to speak for him, exactly, but to make certain nothing in the process could later be dismissed on a technicality. Michael had insisted on presenting the case himself. It was, after all, his daughter's case to close, not anyone else's. The board chair, a retired judge named Foster, opened the folder in front of her and began reading the timeline into the record. The stop, the handcuffing, the extended detainment following dispatch confirmation, the incident report filed that evening. "Officer Brooks," Foster said, "your report describes this as a brief detainment pending verification. Would you care to clarify that characterization, given what we're about to review?" Brooks's jaw tightened. "I followed procedure to the best of my judgment in the moment." "Your Honor, ma'am." It was a fast-moving situation. It was a 12-year-old girl on a bicycle, Michael said, quietly enough that it wasn't a challenge to the room's order. Only a fact laid gently on the table. There was nothing fast-moving about it except how quickly the handcuffs went on. Foster nodded to Michael. "Mr. Carter, you've submitted a substantial evidence package. Please proceed." What followed was not a performance. Michael had built his entire career on the belief that chaos gets defeated by sequence, not by volume. And he treated the folder in front of him the same way he'd treat a scene report, one piece at a time. Each one closing a door the previous witness had left open. He began with the Ring camera footage from a neighbor's porch, time-stamped and unedited, showing the full timeline from Linda's first approach to the moment the cuffs came off. He followed it with a bystander's phone video, different angle, same timeline, corroborating every second. Then the purchase receipt and warranty registration. Then the dispatch confirmation log, time-stamped 2 minutes and 11 seconds after the serial number was called in a full 18 minutes before Brooks finally released Emma. Then came the part of the folder that changed the temperature of the room. Michael laid out the bodycam metadata log, requested through public records, showing a 20-minute gap in footage beginning at the exact minute he'd asked Brooks for his badge number. Beside it, he placed a technical report from an independent forensics reviewer. Renata had brought in a report confirming that the interruption in the footage was not a malfunction. The recording had been manually paused. The room went cemetery silent. Even the clerk's pen stopped moving. "I want to be precise about what I'm alleging," Michael said, his voice never rising, never needing to. "I'm not alleging a technical failure. I'm alleging that a police officer deliberately stopped recording himself at the exact moment he was being asked to identify himself, and that this same officer then filed a report omitting the fact that he handcuffed a child for nearly 20 minutes after her ownership of the bicycle had already been confirmed." Brooks's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. His hand, resting on the folder in front of him, had gone still in a way that looked less like composure and more like a man forgetting, for a moment, how to move it. He started and stopped. Foster turned a page. "There's a supervisor's signature on this report. Sergeant Wallace. Approved same night. No annotations." She looked up. "Sergeant, would you like to explain the speed of that approval?" A man in the second row, Brooks's supervising sergeant, present as a witness, shifted in his seat. "I trust my officer's judgment in the field. I didn't see a reason to slow the process down. You didn't cross-reference it against the body cam log." "No, ma'am." Foster made a note, her expression unreadable, and turned back to the folder. It was at this point that a side door opened, and a man in a gray suit stepped in quietly. Deputy Commissioner Ray Alston, from the county's Office of Public Safety, a man Michael had trained alongside years earlier during a joint interagency exercise. Alston had been asked to observe, given the department's broader concerns about pattern complaints. I took a seat near the front, nodded once to Foster, and then his eyes landed on Michael. "Chief Carter," Alston said, with the small, respectful incline of the head reserved for someone he'd once watched run a multi-agency disaster drill without raising his voice once. "I didn't realize this was your case." The room shifted. Foster looked up. Brooks's union representative looked up. Linda Harper, in the back row, went very still. "Chief Carter," Brooks repeated, almost to himself. The two words landing like a piece of furniture dropped somewhere behind his ribs. His hand found the edge of the table, steadying against it, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint electric hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Somewhere in his memory, uninvited, a training slide surfaced, a 2-day interagency seminar on de-escalation. He'd sat through 18 months earlier. A soft-spoken instructor at the front of the room whose name he'd never bothered to remember. He remembered it now. Michael didn't turn around to acknowledge the reaction. I didn't need to. He had learned long ago that the loudest moment in a room is rarely the one that changes anything. What changes things is the folder still sitting open on the table in front of him. "For the record," Michael said, To Foster, not to Brooks. My title has nothing to do with whether this complaint is valid. It was valid the moment my daughter was handcuffed without cause. It would be equally valid if I sold insurance for a living. I'd ask the board to keep that distinction in mind, because I intend to. It was the single most important sentence Michael said in that entire hearing, and everyone in the room who mattered understood exactly why he'd said it. Brooks, for his part, had stopped looking at his folder entirely. He turned toward Michael for the first time since the hearing began. "Sir, I didn't know who you were. If I'd known." "That's exactly the problem," Michael said, evenly. "Respect for a 12-year-old's rights shouldn't have depended on knowing who her father is. It should have been the default the moment you looked at her." Nobody in the room spoke for a long moment. Somewhere down the hall, a printer hummed. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys. Waiting. Linda Harper, near the back, had gone through her own version of the same collapse a few minutes earlier. Quieter, less noticed, but no less total. She had come into the hearing expecting to repeat the same confident account she'd given at the Riverwalk and posted online the scratch. The certainty, the sense of civic duty she'd wrapped around the whole afternoon like armor. Under Renata's brief, unhurried cross-examination, that armor came apart in a single question. "When was the last time you personally saw your niece's bicycle in person close enough to identify a scratch on the frame?" Linda opened her mouth to answer quickly, then stopped. Her fingers found the strap of her purse and worried at it. "It's been over a year," she admitted, her voice smaller than it had been at any point since the day on the Riverwalk. "But I was certain. I felt certain. Certainty isn't evidence." "Harper," Foster said, not unkindly, simply stating what the record now made undeniable. By the end of the session, Deputy Commissioner Alston had requested, on the spot, that Officer Brooks be placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full internal investigation. Not a suspension, quietly absorbed into next month's schedule, but an on-the-record order. Read aloud. Badge and duty weapons surrendered before he left the building. Sergeant Wallace was referred for a separate review of his approval practices. The Bodycam Records Division was flagged for a department-wide audit. Brooks stood when it was announced, gathering his folder with hands that weren't entirely steady, and for a moment he looked at Michael as if he wanted to say something else, an apology larger than the one he'd already stumbled through. Nothing came. He turned and walked out through the side door, and the sound of his footsteps in the empty hallway was, for a few seconds, the only sound in the building. Do you think that consequence was fair? Or was it too lenient for what Emma went through? It's worth sitting with that question, because Michael Carter was about to ask himself the exact same thing, not about Brooks alone, but about every case like this one that had never made it into a hearing room at all. Michael closed his folder last, after everyone else had already gathered their things. I didn't feel triumphant. He felt, more than anything, the particular exhaustion of a man who has just finished proving something that should never have needed proving in the first place. Outside, in the parking lot, Renata caught up with him. "You did that exactly the way you told me you would," she said. "No theatrics, just the timeline." "The timeline was always going to be enough," Michael said. "It just needed someone to lay it out before anyone could look away from it." I glanced back once at the building, at the lit windows of the hearing room 3 floors up, and thought, briefly, of Emma waiting at home, unaware that the folder he'd carried into that room had just done exactly what he'd promised her it would. I didn't know yet, standing in that parking lot with the folder under his arm, that Alston's mention of pattern complaints was about to open a door far larger than the one he'd just walked through, one that would take him, in the weeks ahead, well beyond his own daughter's case and into a fight he hadn't planned on having. The internal investigation into Officer Daniel Brooks took 6 weeks to conclude. It was not the swift, satisfying ending The video clips online seemed to promise no dramatic firing on the spot, no perpy walk out of headquarters. It was slower than that, and in its own way, more honest. Brooks remained on administrative leave the entire time, his badge and weapons still in a drawer at the department, while investigators worked through the body cam audit, the falsified report, and the pattern of complaints. Deputy Commissioner Alston had quietly flagged weeks earlier. When the findings were finally released, Brooks was terminated for cause not simply for the stop itself, but for deliberately disabling his recording device and filing a report that omitted the truths. He would not be eligible for rehire anywhere in the county. Sergeant Wallace received a formal reprimand and a mandatory retraining requirement for approving reports without cross-checking them against available footage. A smaller consequence, but a permanent mark on a 20-year record that would follow him for the rest of his career. The department's body cam records division underwent a full audit, which turned up 2 more unexplained gaps in footage from unrelated incidents that same year, both now reopened for review. Linda Harper's reckoning arrived more quietly, but no less completely. The HOA board voted 5-1 to remove her from her position, citing conduct that had exposed the association to legal and reputational harm. She posted no follow-up explanation to the neighborhood Facebook group. The original post simply disappeared one afternoon, deleted without comment. When the Carters' civil suit for defamation was settled months later, the terms required a public correction posted to that same group, a single paragraph, carefully worded by lawyers, admitting she had made an accusation without verifying it, and that it had caused real harm to a child. Michael never asked to see it. Renata told him it had been posted. That was enough. None of it, Michael would tell people later, felt like victory. It felt like the slow, unglamorous work of making a system tell the truth about itself, which he'd come to believe was the only kind of justice that actually held. Weeks after the hearing, Michael took Emma back to the Riverwalk on a Saturday afternoon, the same stretch of path where it had all started. I didn't announce it as anything significant. He simply asked if she wanted to ride, and she said yes. They walked the bikes down together in silence for the first few minutes, past the bench where Michael had once been told to wait, past the spot where the cuffs had gone on. Emma slowed there, just slightly, and Michael slowed with her, saying nothing, letting her decide what she needed from the moment. "You have every right to still feel scared here," he said finally. "That doesn't go away just because the right things happened afterward. But don't let the fear be the one deciding how you live." Emma looked at the path for a long moment. Then she climbed onto her bike, the same turquoise frame, cleaned and oiled every evening for 2 weeks by a father who never once demanded she be ready before she was, and pedaled forward, slow and steady, past the bench, past the water, past the place where a stranger's certainty had once cost her nearly 20 minutes of her childhood. She didn't look back to see if he was watching. She didn't need to. Michael stood there, watching his daughter ride into the afternoon light with her shoulders finally, fully unbowed, and understood that this, not the hearing, not the termination, not the settlement, was the actual ending he'd been fighting for. A few months later, at a routine briefing, Deputy Commissioner Alston mentioned to Michael, almost in passing, that Emma's case had prompted a wider review 4 other complaints in the county over the past 2 years, all involving minors, all with strikingly similar gaps in documentation. Nothing had been done with any of them before. Michael closed the folder. Alston handed him and sat with it for a long moment before speaking. "Then we're not finished," he said. I began, in the months that followed, working alongside Renata and a handful of other advocates to push for department-wide reforms, mandatory verification protocols before any detainment of a minor, independent audits of body cam systems, a faster, less discretionary path for families to file and be heard. It wasn't the kind of work that made headlines. It rarely does. But it was the kind of work Michael had built his entire life around. Not chasing recognition, but making sure the next family standing on a sunlit path wouldn't have to fight as hard as his had. Here is the thing worth sitting with. Long after the details of this story fade, nobody on that path knew who Michael Carter was the day his daughter was handcuffed. Not the officer. Not the woman with the phone. Not a single person filming from the sidelines. I looked. To all of them. Like just another father in a polo shirt, and that was precisely the point. His worth was never something a badge or a title had to confirm. It was there all along. In the way he raised his daughter. In the patience he chose when anger would have been so much easier. In the quiet, deliberate work of telling the truth until someone had no choice but to listen. That's the part these stories tend to leave out. The badge doesn't create the character. It just decides, sometimes unfairly, who gets believed first. So here's what we'd love to know from you. Has someone ever underestimated you because of how you looked, what you wore, or where you came from, only to find out later exactly who they were talking to? Tell us that story in the comments, because these stories always hit differently when they're real. And if a story like Emma's reminded you why patience, evidence, and a little bit of quiet strength can outlast almost anything, that's exactly the kind of story we like to tell here. Subscribe if you want more of them, and we'll see you in the next one.